Not many bikes give you front preload adjustment. I have a Tiger 1200 with Triumph semi-active suspension. That gives me no front preload adjustment. That's very common. That's really common, in fact. But you know what? Honda give you front preload adjustment on a lot of their bikes, and it's dead handy. I'm going to tell you what I use it for, and I'm going to give you some funny suspension facts about this CB1100. But this could be any Honda, but I'm particularly talking about this one, obviously, because it's my bike. Now, first off, I'm going to say what Honda say in the manual about their front suspension. Spring preload on the front. You can adjust the spring preload by the adjuster to suit the load or the road surface. Turn clockwise to increase spring preload, and in brackets they have hard. Or turn the counterclockwise to decrease the spring preload, soft. I don't like the way they say hard or soft. The spring rate is the spring rate. That's it. And they give you the similar description on the rear, on that rear shock. But if I up the rear preload on that rear shock, I'm not making that spring stiffer. The spring rate on that spring is the spring rate on that spring. All I'm doing is modifying where that shock sits in its stroke. And in fact, I can see a little bit of progressiveness with this spring at the top and underneath each shroud. These are tighter cords, so that's going to take less effort to start moving this spring. If I actually increase the preload on this shock, I'm going to be further up the stroke of this shock, and surely I'm going to get back some of my lower progressive spring rate here. Look, that's my theory. I do wish manufacturers wouldn't talk about hard and soft in relation to preload. Look, I know it's Honda, they're a huge manufacturing conglomerate. They know exactly what they're doing with their motorbikes. Far be it from me to question Honda. But a spring rate is a spring rate. Changing preload does not change the spring rate. Now, people say, but my bike feels harder when I sit on the bike, when I up the preload. It's just because you're overcoming some forces. Let's say my preload position here is on 2 out of 5 and a 100 kilo guy sits on it. Great, the bike goes down that much. Now, a 150 kilo guy sits on it now. And that's quite a heavy guy. But so the bike's gonna sag even more. So the idea is you up the preload to get back to the same level as the guy who was sitting on there at 100 kilos. So in both instances, for the 150 kilo guy and the 100 kilo guy, the shock will be sitting in the same area of its stroke. So it's to have that shock somewhere in the top 20 to 30%, 25, 30% of its stroke to give you maximum movement, maximum travel. So look, that's the basis first. So what I'm saying is, look, there's no damping adjustment on this bike. So I'm saying that's what Honda said in the manual. That's what preload's for. But I'm going to talk about specifically Honda's preload adjustment on the front of a lot of the bikes and what I use it for and how I think it's dead handy. So first off, I'm 120 kilos all clobbered up. I know, I've eaten 1 or 2 pies in my life. So yeah, I have to add some preload to those 2 rear shocks. So I'm going to add 2 notches of preload to those rear shocks because I'm using up too much of my shock compression travel. So I'll do that both sides. There's an adjuster in the toolkit. And what I'd say is, look, if you're a kind of regular 70, 80 kilo person, you can probably leave those rear preload adjusters in the stock position. But if you're kind of 90 kilos, I would add another extra notch of rear preload on either side. Well, you always do the same either side. If you're kind of 110 kilos plus, and this is fully clothed with all your helmet and your gear and everything like that, I would add 2 notches of preload from the stock position. And you leave your last notch free for, let's say, pillion or a load of luggage or something like that. So I'm getting my stroke back on the rear end to compensate for my weight. So I'll do that first. So this is my stock position. I have a preload adjuster tool here that came with the toolkit with the bike. So one notch up, 2 notch up. So 20 seconds to do that either side on both shocks. So now I've compensated for my weight on that rear preload. I'm never going to change that again. It's going to stay the same. Unless I pile a load of luggage on this or take a pillion, that's going to stay that way forever. See all those bikes with automatic preload, like my Triumph Tiger 1200. When you sit on that or add a pillion or add luggage or anything like that, it measures the sag on the bike and adjusts the preload. It's just replacing that. That's exactly what it was doing there. Exactly what I've done there with that rear shock. That's all those automatic preload bikes are doing. They're just adding more preload, the more weight went on the bike, and they're taking preload off when the weight comes off. And they're not constantly doing it. They're measuring it. In my Triumph, it'll measure it. It'll measure it while you're stopped at the lights or stopped in your driveway or wherever. But it's not constantly changing the preload level. Once it's measured it once, it's set, and your preload will be set for your journey and you'll be off. As long as your weight doesn't change, your preload adjustment won't change. So all those super duper electronic suspension and everything like that, it's handy that it measures the preload for you. Like, you know, you don't have to go around with one of these. This is what you're paying millions of dollars for, fellas. But that's all it's replacing. It's just convenience, that's all. It's something you can do yourself in 20 seconds. You're going off on tour on something like this, yeah, good luck. If you're loaded up with luggage and two up in this, you only have to change that. It'll take you 20 seconds to up the rear preload on that and you're done. All the big electronic bikes are doing for you. I'm measuring that rear sag and setting the preload. Because once your weight's your weight, that's it. It doesn't need to keep changing the preload on a journey. So what about the front preload? Okay, well look, if we thought we'd go through the same exercise and say, right, I want to adjust my front preload so I've used around about 25 to 30% of my suspension travel. So all I can do this by myself. I can put a cable tie around my fork and see how much the suspension moves. I know how much travel I can get on this fork from the specifications of the bike and adjust that front preload. Only there's a problem. There's a big problem. So we get to the front and we think, right, we'll adjust the front preload on this. I'll adjust it so I'm using about 25 to 30% of my suspension travel. And so I got on the bike and started playing around with the preload and started measuring how much of the travel I was using. And on this bike, the maximum travel on the front is 107 millimeters. And Jesus, I can actually use, with the preload at a minimum on this bike, I was using 56% of the suspension travel, the compression travel on the front. But if I put the preload up to maximum, I was using 42% of the suspension travel. So I'm 42% of my way in to the stroke of that front suspension. That's too much. You'd think now, there's a story coming here. I'm thinking, okay, you're a right fat bastard. You need a spring rate, a higher spring rate to stop that much sag. But I'm thinking, hang on a minute, this bike's got a carrying capacity of something like 173 kilos. What, I'm 50 kilos below that with all the gear up. So, what's the story? So I decided to work out what the bike was using of the suspension. The bike sag at the front with the preload in the minimum position is using nearly 49% of its travel. And with the preload in the maximum position was using 29% of its travel. So you're thinking, oh great, yeah, just max the preload, just screw it all the way in and use max preload. Then I've used about, 30-35% of my travel at the back there, 29% of my front. Maybe I could drop that off a little bit, use a bit more. No, that doesn't seem right. That's not right. I haven't got back on the bike yet. There's no way I'm going to get around the sort of 25-30% of sag of that front with this bike. What's the story? That's the way Honda designed it. They're expecting you. It's a bit wrong of them to say, well, max travel at the front is 107 mil. Yeah, max travel either way is 107 mil, but you're going to sit a good way into the stroke on the front of this bike. And if I max the preload right out on the front of this bike or change the spring rate to only have 25-30% sag on the front of this bike, the thing would be sitting up in the air like this and it'd be handling like a bad one. So this isn't a mistake by Honda, and it's not me being overweight. They've designed the bike this way. Really, the front suspension travel is 107 mil, but they're being a bit disingenuous by kind of intimating that you can use a lot of that. It's almost like saying it's an 80 mil travel bike, really, because it's the compression stroke we're interested in. So, so am I saying Honda have made a mistake? No, I'm not saying they've made a mistake at all. That's exactly how they've designed that bike. Who am I to question a Honda engineer? But what they've done for you is brilliant, giving you this front adjustable preload. What I've done, I've adjusted my rear preload. That's great. The bike's set up for my weight now, and I found the bike steering quite well. But what I decided to do is ignore any sag calculations at the front. Just ignore them. And what I could do is move one ring back on the front preload. Where's my screwdriver? That's the stock preload position. Move both forks. There we are, back one ring. And that has the effect of reducing the front preload, and that's dropping that front down slightly. It's dropping the front end of the bike down slightly. It's ever so slightly shortening the trail of the bike, that angle where the fork touches the ground and the axle, bottom of the tire touches the ground. It's shortened that position there. And it's made the bike handle a bit better. It makes it handle really nicely. So what I'm suggesting is we use the rear shock preload in its traditional way, not to make the suspension harder or softer, but to adjust for load. And then we use the front preload as a handling adjuster. Forget sag, forget everything about sag, forget rider sag, forget bike sag, static sag, whatever. Just use these to adjust the handling of your bike once you've set your rear preload for your weight. It makes a huge difference. It makes a huge difference. When I had the original Dunlop tires on this bike, I dropped the front preload from factory 3 rings to 4 rings. And that dropped the front end of the bike, the nose down a bit like that. Had this handling really, really sharply. Fantastic, fantastic. Then I got my wheels changed to tubeless, and I put some Bridgestone T31s on. And this thing was going around the corners like pin sharp. In fact, you got to a bend and it just dropped in, super easy. And I think at the time on the video, I said, oh, it drops in maybe a bit too fast. So what that allowed me then to do, because the bike was steering beautifully, is add some preload back, which gave me more compression travel on the front, but had the bike steering wonderfully again. So that's the two the same. So I've added a lot more preload on the front. So all I've done though, is I've got some of my front preload back. I've increased my compression stroke. So I could, if I hit a bigger bump, I've got a longer compression travel. But what I've actually done is I've changed the attitude of the bike back to one where I can get really nice handling. So I've got nice neutral handling now. But wait, there's more. It's genius, it's bloody genius. Look, our tires often wear at different rates. And so as our tire wears, the bike starts changing its attitude. If the rear tire's wearing faster, it's pulling the bike down like that. If the front tire's wearing faster, it's changing the bike like that. So now you can, and it's weird. I think on this bike, my rear tire is wearing faster, and on my Triumph, my front tire wears faster. That might be something to do with the weight and everything like that. But as the tires wear, if they're wearing at a different rate, the attitude of the bike is changing. And you go, now look, give over now. Surely, look, that's not going to make any bloody difference. It does. It makes a big difference. I know what you're thinking. Tyre wear affecting my handling. It does, I'm telling you. Look, I just changed the back tyre of my Triumph Tiger. There's 8mm of usable thread. 8mm of usable tread on that tyre, in that groove. So I got a brand new tyre just on there. So I've increased my rear by 8mm just by changing that tyre. I haven't changed the front because there's some left on it. But if you imagine the difference between the wear patterns on the front and rear, I could have like a good 10, 12mm difference between the front and rear tyre, depending on when I got them changed and stuff like that. So that has an impact. This front preload adjuster lets you take account of that tyre wear. So then I could adjust for that difference with my preload. So depending on which tyre's wearing faster, if my rear is wearing faster, my bike's coming back a bit, it starts steering a bit slower, so I could back off some of that front preload and bring the front end back down again, or vice versa. So rear preload, set and forget. Front preload changes, the conditions change, and keep your handling perfect. It's absolutely brilliant. So use that front preload to adjust the stance of your bike and get your handling right. It makes all the difference. Manufacturers don't make motorbikes that handle shite. If your bike handles like a right crock, it just means you haven't adjusted it properly. Nobody makes bikes, especially people like Honda and Kawasaki and Triumph and all those people. Nobody makes rubbish handling bikes. If you get a vlogger or a YouTuber who talks about the thing fights you around corners or it doesn't go around bends properly and everything like that, they just haven't set up the suspension for them, that's all. And it's so easy. And do you know what has the same effect? Yeah, lowering or raising your forks through your clamps. In this case, I got plenty of room to do that. This is actually in the stock position, but I could raise or lower these forks if I had to. But look, I have preload adjusters on there, so I'd never need to. That just happens to be the stock position. But on some bikes, you wouldn't be able to do that. You can definitely get these forks up the clamps a little bit if you needed to, but you're definitely not going to increase that distance. There's nowhere for that to go down. So that's another great reason why we got the preload adjuster. No need to muck around raising and lowering forks in our clamps. Right, time to own up. How many of you who've had one of these for ages and ages, years, you didn't know that this bit was for measuring depth? Ooh. Ooh. We all know this is for the inner diameter or something, don't we? Yeah. No, that wasn't very condescending. I thought that was kind of very engineering-like, wasn't it?